This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net. And today it is time for the Intentionality Gurus with Candace Pollock. And we are talking about grief and our history of losses. And before we went on air, one of the things I mentioned to Candace is that in many of our podcasts over the last couple weeks, there's been conversation about grief. And not intentionally have we chosen to make this a theme for all of our shows. Um, but I'm finding that there's something going on, it seems like in the atmosphere, that is have us talking about this. So welcome, Candace, and maybe you can enlighten us.
Yeah, there's this phenomenon called reticulation. In fact, our brains are wired to look for patterns. That's what, in essence, reticulation is all about. And so when we purchase, say, a yellow Volkswagen, we will start to see yellow Volkswagens all over the place, right? They were probably always there in the same numbers. They were, coming to our attention or not. But once we have something that enters our brain consciousness, we'll start to look for patterns, particularly if it's coupled with emotions, because we're signaling to the brain, this is important. And then it kind of goes about its business of looking for more of that, all right, which, suggests that there's motives and everything else behind it, but it's just a physical phenomena that is there for probably historically evolutionary reasons.
Interesting. Huh.
So maybe if, way back when in primitive times, a creature noticed, green tops on a tree or something, that would be some indication that there was water nearby. So that those patterns are important to our survival and so on. This is how it's been explained to me in my reading about it. So, or maybe because, as you suggested, we're all dealing with a lot of stresses and changes and so on. And as we discussed in the prior segments on grief is the natural, normal response to a change in a familiar pattern or behavior, right? So it's the conflicting emotions we feel about it. We can have relief around it, or we can have sadness around it. Even non-death scenarios triggering grief can have some happy parts to it, getting a promotion or moving to a different location. But then there's the saying goodbye to the familiar things that we have. So that's why it's this mix of feelings that can be very confusing and challenging sometimes.
Okay.
So today we're going to talk about history of losses. And, I'm steeped in this stuff now, so that to me, this is not Debbie Downer stuff, but I have to remind myself that it's not something we normally talk about unless and until something happens. But the reason I wanted to raise some consciousness around this is because, in part, the fallout from COVID and all the other stuff that has occurred, people not having financial security, uncertainty about people being able to return to work, when are we going to be able to return to schools and so on. So these are just ripe for triggering all of the stuff that might be latently existing in our psyches in terms about losses in our security and so on.
Absolutely.
So we're going to talk about our history of losses, which sounds like a lot of fun, right?
Yeah. I wrote a blog this morning and I felt that's what I was doing in my own life. So interesting.
Yeah, so all of the material we're talking about is based on the grief recovery method. It's a specific standard approach to resolving our grief. And it doesn't mean we're not feeling the loss anymore. It just means that we're taking some of the suffering part out, the part that keeps us stuck or makes us, engage in activities that don't serve us because of the grief.
Right.
So our history of losses generally will go back to some prior time than the precipitating event that might bring us to the grief recovery method. So this is not the program. I'm just talking about some of the elements to kind of eliminate some of the unknowingness about the method so that people can recognize that it's really an effective way of dealing with the elements that cause the suffering when we've lost something, those conflicting
Sure.
feelings. So it's not just deaths and so on. And so they have this process. It's the only evidence-based grief recovery program out there. It has been peer reviewed and published in peer journals and so on. And they're continuing to test the different methods of delivering it. So initially it was only an in-person program for a specified number of weeks. And now they've rolled out one-on-one online programs. And soon they will be rolling out an online group program so that it can be accessible to more people. So again, grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or a change in a familiar pattern or of behavior. And so that could be, as I said, a move, it could be a promotion, it could be having to stay home because of COVID, it could be uncertainty, it could be financial, a boon, it could be winning the lottery, it could be losing money and so on. So we've already established that it's natural and normal. What isn't necessarily helpful is many of the ways that we have been taught to deal with it. And it's not something that we, for the most part, unless you've gone through this training, are consciously doing so in a helpful way. Most of it is steeped in myths. We talked about that the last time. We also talked about the stress-related energy relieving behaviors, also known as STIRBs, like overeating or avoiding, or like, I was binge watching Law and Order for many, many months. And the losses that are buried, or those that we have unfinished business around, are the ones where we're going to have the suffering. We can't eliminate the pain of a loss necessarily, but it's the suffering part that keeps us stuck. So the grief recovery method has this part of its process that includes what we call a loss history graph. And it is a process of identifying our losses going back to a particular time. So and can you remember the very first time that you experienced a loss?
Well, and it's interesting because I wrote a blog about it this morning. When my maternal grandmother died, it was right around my 9th birthday. And I had seen her a couple days prior. And, she promised me that she was going to see me for my birthday. She didn't. She ended up having a stroke, went into the hospital, and passed away. And the way my parents had me deal with it, I was told I was too young to go to the funeral home, too young to go to the funeral itself. However, in the Jewish religion, we celebrate or we observe 7 days of, and I don't even want to call it mourning, but I guess that's what it's supposed to be. And to me, uh, what happened was, I went to school. I don't even remember who picked me up and took me to my aunt's house where we were sitting Shiva for the week. And I walked in and it felt like a big party. There was food everywhere, people coming and going. People were, dressed up. And again, we're talking about in the 50s where people, if you went to visit somebody, you got dressed up. Um, but for 7 days, it was like one big party. And yet in between, my mother and her sisters smiling and laughing, they were sitting there crying as well. And I remember asking, like, why are we having a party? You know, my Bubby's not here. She died. And my mother said, well, it's not a party, but it's a time to have memories. And it was just too confusing to me. I never understood it until her husband died 9 years later. So now I'm 18 years old. I'm old enough to go to a funeral, but my mother wouldn't let me see my grandfather. She wanted me to remember him the way I knew him. And so again, I had all these conflicting thoughts like, w- you know, is it fearful to see him? Why can't I? And yet, you know, along with all the other adults, I talked about all the great things about him and the things that made me feel good. And all of a sudden, I found that I was laughing. And I never really, um, I don't think, mourned for either one of them because I was told by my parents, you know, I was too young to do it. And that's been difficult. And so now I write about it a lot, um, bringing out those memories and allowing myself to feel teary or cry or get some of those thoughts out. Um, so that's my first experience with loss.
And so that's a perfect illustration of a mix of the things we've learned already. So one, there are two losses here, possibly
Right.
more, and others told you how you should think and behave and feel,
Exactly.
and you complied. I mean, how would you not? I mean, you were too young to know otherwise. But even if you were an adult, sometimes those external influences can be, dominant.
Right.
And the whole idea in the grief recovery method, we talk about completing a loss, and it's kind of a confusing phrase. It's a shorthand for the process of when a relationship, say with a person, has been lost due to death, for instance. And we, even if we know ahead of time that the death is imminent, we don't always have an opportunity to communicate the things that we wish were different, more or less. All right. Sometimes it just occurs and there's things that were left unsaid
Sure.
and uncommunicated. So that's the idea, one of the ideas behind the grief recovery method. So it's not the loss necessarily, and this is my paraphrase, I'm not speaking on behalf of the grief recovery people, but the idea is to be able to communicate what was left undone at the time. All right. So as a 9-year-old, how would you be able to express this, number one?
Right.
And two, you'd probably be voted, down by the family because it was theoretically too upsetting for you. But on
Right.
some level, it was upsetting to you anyway.
Mhm.
All right. So you're not insulated from it. So what kinds of things have bubbled up for you about those losses in particular, or just a sensitivity to grief?
Well, it's made me realize that I've had other losses as well. And as we talked about the last time, they're not always associated with death. Um, but so many times, like you said, even as an adult, I had people around me trying to influence me that, either you shouldn't feel this way or you should feel this way. And, you know, I would listen because nobody ever, I guess, taught me um, how to feel what I wanted to feel or what I needed to feel. And I realized that it's only probably within the last 10 years that I've allowed myself, to close off what other people are saying. It's if I feel like crying, I'm going to cry. If I feel like laughing, I'm going to laugh. If I need to talk about something, I'm going to talk about it. Um, but prior to then, it was always like I was waiting to get somebody else's permission. And
Yeah, and I think I've mentioned that friend of mine who is 100% Greek, and his family was constantly in his face about he should marry this person, he should marry this person, what he should do, and so on. And when I knew him, he was in his 40s, and I said something or other. We were buddied up in a coaching program together, so we had to interact on a lot of the exercises together. And he was relaying how stressful this process was. He's now deceased, but he was relaying how stressful this process was. And I said, are you living by committee? And his quip back was, no, Greek chorus. But it was the same thing. The family, he wasn't able to make his own decisions in their eyes. So they had to, more or less make the decisions for him. And obviously, they're not necessarily going to make the best decisions for him. Only he can make that decision. And because we're so ill prepared, the way we're so uncomfortable with grief, and not just grief from dying, but certainly grief from dying, we as individuals are very ill prepared to deal with loss. And that is, particularly true with younger grievers, because where would they turn? It's not something we know innately.
Right.
All right. And the idea is that what we've lost before and the way we've dealt with it, or we haven't dealt with it, can color how we're dealing now. All right. So you have become more comfortable addressing these things. And so what has, in that regard, what has changed for you besides just being more comfortable? Anything in particular?
Well, it's made me look deeper into my relationships in other things that I'm doing. So because I, basically was taught to be this good little girl, even when I became an adult, I'm now learning that you can still be a good person, but have um, your own thoughts about how you should act. And uh, I don't sit around and wait for permission anymore. Um, so, like for instance, when I left corporate America, and basically was pushed out the door, that was very heart wrenching for me. Yet I knew it was the best thing for me. And yet, when I started really grieving about it, grieving about all the things I was losing from having to leave corporate America, I was getting messages from those around me. You should be happy now. You don't have to deal with this on a daily basis. And I finally found my voice and said, you know, I can be happy that I don't have to deal with the terrible things on a daily basis, but I'm sad that I couldn't have made those things more bearable. But I didn't, and maybe I couldn't have. But that's what I was grieving, that I couldn't have had a different outcome than the outcome I had gone through.
So you just underscored it there. So this is, what do we want, more, less, or to be different? And that's a perfect example. So that's the crux of the suffering, right? The grief is still there, the loss is still there, but the I don't want to say extreme pain, but the suffering part is pain. And we've talked about it before that, Buddhist philosophy basically says that, we cling to things or we avoid to things, which means we don't stay in the present and just accept things as they are. It doesn't mean that you're going to be a doormat, but it just means that, not clinging or avoiding. And where suffering comes in, there will be change. Change is unavoidable. It's inevitable. There will be change. But where the suffering occurs is in the clinging and the avoiding, as if it could be different. It can't be. All right. And it's the same thing here. So you just underscored it. So you would have wanted it to try something you wanted to have different with that job is to at least have an opportunity. What are some other things that might have been more or less that you would have wanted or different?
Well, even when I go back and I look at my divorce, that I think I had that same feeling too. That um, again, I don't think I was a doormat, but I was avoiding what was going on around me,
Mhm.
and I wish that I had maybe not avoided it and had dealt with it. I think I'm sure the outcome would have been exactly the same, but I think I would have walked away stronger with less burden. Um, and I know, like, when we talk about those losses, um, I was able to unburden myself when my mother was dying. So, as sad as the loss of her was to me, I was able to um, deal with it in such a way that um, it's a different type of grief. Um, it's more about, like, driving down the road yesterday and I thought, oh, I'm going to call my mom. And it was like, oh, I can't.
Right.
But it's, I don't think I ever had that real heavy burden after she passed away because we had talked so much. So I had more of those good memories of talking to her.
So it wasn't clouded by all of the things that you didn't get to communicate, and
Right.
that
Right.
you did make different because you were able to communicate.
Exactly.
So, that is just, again, such a superb example of what this whole methodology is about, plus other things. I mean, just this part, why we go through the loss history graph to identify these things, because when this is what they call this part of the method. When we do this part of the method, we can see our history of losses that we plot out on a little chart. And then that gives us an opportunity to make discoveries about ourselves. Some things that we might have forgotten, long buried, or just clouded by, life, all the other stuff going on. And then we realize something that happened that was, maybe significant in some ways. It kind of informs how we handled other things, like the domino theory.
Right.
But you just did a perfect job of explaining that, and the difference between when you were able to convey your thoughts and feelings, say with your mom, to with the job loss or the divorce, things that were left incomplete in a sense. You didn't get to close the loop on and
Right.
communicate.
And I sometimes think in our daily life, we do a lot of avoiding of things because we don't want to um, disturb the status quo. Um, in fact, I have a friend right now who is um, sticking in a relationship which may not be the best for her, and she'll admit that. Okay, but she's afraid to say that too loud because then that relationship may actually end, and she's not ready to deal with that either. And so I think sometimes we create our own sadness and grief um, because we don't know how to deal with it up front and maybe, like, get through it and move on. And so we make it even bigger um, and more painful if and when it does come to an end.
Again, that Buddhist philosophy of the avoiding the change, or something new, is what is causing the suffering
Right.
aspect of it. So that what the phrase is, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. And I mean, it's not that easy, obviously, if it were, we would all be successful in avoiding it and be enlightened. But as Ram Dass apparently has said, you think you're so enlightened, go home for the holidays to your family, and like for 3 days, and you'll be confronted with all of the things that you have not achieved enlightenment around, evolvement around.
It's funny that you should say that because when my dad was still alive, and my mom and dad lived in Michigan. My parents would drive down here for 24 hours. They'd come in on a Saturday afternoon, and they'd stay through Saturday night, and usually didn't stay with us. They usually stayed at my mother-in-law's house. Then we'd see them for brunch the next morning, and then they were off. And every once in a while, I would complain to them, like, well, you're not working, like, why don't you stay an extra day or two? And my father would always say to me, you want to see me again, don't you? And and it, I knew exactly what he was saying because I sort of felt the same way because after 24 hours, um, you know, we all did have enough of each other because we concentrated everything in that time. But if they would have come for more than 24 hours, I think it could have been a very painful experience for all of us. And so, sometimes father does know best. So I'm glad that that's how they did it because Alex got to know them and enjoy them. And he would look forward to their visits rather than, oh, they're coming again.
Well, I remember my parents saying that, they grew up in an era where you had, parties and, the social obligations. Somebody invites you to their house, you invite them back. And so,
Right.
and what they would tell their daughters, who turned out all to be kind of shy, and not giving parties, but is that be among the first to leave because it's always challenging for the host and the guest when they're the last to leave. So just knowing when to leave. The other
Yeah.
expression I remember somebody sharing is that fish and guests have something in common. After 3 days, they begin to stink.
Yes. Yes. My father would always say that too. And I'd look at him and go, oh, yeah,
Even
I can relate
relatives,
to that. Yeah.
maybe especially relatives.
Yep.
So what I wanted to convey today was just the sequence. Because this component in the grief recovery method that John James discovered over time is an essential foundational block to the next element that I'd like to talk about the next time, where we start to put the last pieces together, right? Because this is just a step in the direction of creating that complete cycle of communication, those undelivered communications, the things we want more or less of, that we didn't have an opportunity to communicate.
Absolutely. I'd also like our listeners to think about something because it hit me um, today at work, and that is, um, for the last year, we basically have isolated ourselves, even if it meant we were wearing a mask to isolate ourselves from other people. And now, the CDC says, if you've been vaccinated, fully vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask. And at my job yesterday, I wore the mask. Today, I didn't um, because I had a slight headache, and I know the mask sometimes can make my headaches worse. And I'm fully vaccinated. But I have to tell you that um, it was hard for me not to wear it. It was almost like that was like a safety blanket for the last year. And so I'm making a change that I know I'm happy that we're getting out of this, but I'm also feeling that some of the good things that did happen in the past year may be going away too. And I associate that with the mask. And so,
Interesting. I had exactly the same experience. I had to stand in line at to get my driver's license updated, and most of the people were not wearing masks. And I had read that even though we may be fully vaccinated, we could still be a carrier and infect somebody
right.
who's not. And, my older sister has multiple sclerosis and she's in another state. But the point is, there can be people like that with already an overactive immune system that are, hesitant to get the vaccination or There are reasons why they can't. And, small children who can be carriers, they're
Right.
carriers anyway, right?
Sure.
And so I was feeling the same sense of, I don't know if I'm ready to let go of the mask. I certainly like the freedom to be out and about, but it would just kill me if I accidentally infected somebody. And, I deal with the elderly, a lot of elderly, not
Right.
just the elderly. But, they're very vulnerable. So I think I'm going to continue to wear mine and be unabashed about it.
Well, and again, it was like, oh, well, I have the freedom not to wear it. So I just got out of my car, didn't put it on. Um, but the whole time I was working, I was feeling that loss.
Yeah.
And I didn't identify it really till as I was walking out of the store, because usually once I walk out the store, I sort of would loosen it as I walked to my car. And today it was like, oh, it's not there. And then I got to the car and I saw it sitting on the seat. And it was like, you know, hey, I want to rejoice over this, but it doesn't feel rejoiceful yet. And there's going to be a lot of things like that that I think we're going to see, um, you know, that we got so used to this past year that might be affecting us. So if our listeners, come up with something, please share it with us, because, the more we communicate about these things, the healthier all of us are going to be.
Yeah, and so for anybody that wants to explore more, you can get the Grief Recovery Handbook from Amazon. It's, in Audible, and it's available in other book locations and so on. So it's called the Grief Recovery Handbook, and there's a second edition out. So that's the most recent edition. And I highly recommend it, because it's for any kinds of loss, like you just described, the mixed feelings we have about now being free, maskless. Maybe not everybody, but for those who feel it. So thanks for the opportunity to share it. So we'll be talking about another segment in the process the next time.
Very good. Well, we'll see everybody in 2 weeks. In the meantime, stay safe and make the choice on your own whether to wear or not wear your mask. Have a great day. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. Take care.